Hello, my name is Nate, and I'm a slow reader. Back in 11th grade, I had one of my favorite teachers. He was a literature teacher. His name was Mr. Wydell. And he was funny. He made the books that we're reading come alive and be interesting, and we had great discussions. But because I'm a slow reader, I often would do all my other homework first, and then I'd be too tired and I wouldn't have time to do the reading for the literature class. And apparently, I wasn't the only one because we got to one class session, and Mr. Wydell was trying to start a discussion about the book that we were supposed to have read. And it was clear that most of the class had not read the book. And he got up and sat up on the desk at the front of the room like he tended to do and looked around at us. And this generally happy go lucky guy kind of got stern with us and said, "You know, I get the feeling that you're taking advantage of my good nature." And it's amazing. Decades have passed since that moment, but I still remember exactly those words. You're taking advantage of my good nature. I've even used them myself sometimes. And it was true. We were taking advantage of the fact that he's fun loving, he's easygoing. And because of that, we thought, well, we can get away with not doing our homework and not doing our reading. And we all felt guilty about that. And turns out that's what's happening here too, as Paul addresses the Romans. He says, we're in Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Well then, should we keep on sinning so that God can show us more and more of his wonderful grace? So in other words, now that we've learned that we fall under grace and not under the law, now that the Christians in the first century are experiencing grace for the first time, they're starting to take advantage of God's good nature. They're starting to take advantage of the fact that grace is going to cover any of their sins. And so they just go on sinning because they can get away with it. And Paul says, of course not. Since we have died to sin, how can we continue to live in it? Skipping down to verse 5, since we have been united with him, Jesus, in his death, we will also be raised to life as he was. We know that our old sinful selves were crucified with Christ, so that sin might lose its power in our lives. We are no longer slaves to sin. Now hold on to that for 1 second as we skip to verse 16. Don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living. Verse 18 says, now you are free from your slavery to sin, and you have become slaves to righteous living. You see, as it turns out, you have to choose someone as your master. You can choose to be a slave to sin, or you can be a slave to God, a slave to righteous living, but you're going to serve somebody. And before we were saved, we were slaves to sin. Like we had no other option. We couldn't not sin. It was the only way that we knew how to live. And because of that, as verse 16 says, that sin leads to death. But choosing to obey God leads to righteous living and ultimately leads to life. Now, it's interesting to me here because you learned that before we followed Jesus, before we knew of grace, we could only go one direction. Sin had its grip on us. We were slaves to it. There's nothing we can do about it. And because of Christ, we are free from that slavery, but we're not just free to do whatever. And that's what Paul's saying. We're not just, now that we're free from the grip of sin, we're not free to then sin all that we want to because grace covers us. No, we're still, now we're slaves to a different master, but we're slaves to a benevolent master, one who wants to give us life and life abundantly. And don't miss this either. Verse 16 says, you can be a slave to sin, which leads to death. We often think of the life before we knew Christ as kind of living it up, living the party life, living the happy-go-lucky, do whatever we want, sinful lifestyle. And we almost revere that as like something good that we're giving up that we have to now leave behind in order to follow Jesus. But that's not true. It's very clear here. And if you remember accurately to your time before Christ, you realize that living the sinful lifestyle may have been pleasant for a moment, but ultimately led to feelings of guilt. It led to bad decisions. It led to broken relationships. It led to hurting yourself. It led to hurting other people. It doesn't lead to life. It leads to death, and it leads to living out that death here on earth too. It's not an alive way to live. The way to truly live is to live righteously, to follow Christ. So as you reflect now on your transition from being a sinner, a slave to sin, to being a slave to the ways of God, realize that that's a freedom. That's a freedom to live in a way that leads to your ultimate, to everything good that life has to offer, and ultimately living the way that Jesus wants you to live. So let's not take advantage of God's good nature, God's perfect nature, by living as sinners after we've been saved from our sin. Let's instead live according to God's good nature, live this new life in Christ that leads to life. So with that, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.